Masechet Yevamot Daf Nuntet. Mishnah we've been discussing was about a Kohen who's married to someone who he's not allowed to be married to, a Kohen to a Gerusha, Kohen Gadol to an Almanah, and says that if they were only engaged, only Kiddushin, and then they divorce, then she can go back to her father's house and continue eating Tirumah, because there was only Erusin, not Nisuin. However, if there was Nisuin with in a prohibited relation, if she was a divorcee, for example, and then even after, if there was full Nisuin, then even after he dies or they get divorced, she is halala permanently and can never go back. All right, so that's what we're going to discuss, but we're going to start off with an interesting question. This question, Ba'amineh Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef Mishemuel, Kohen Gadol shekidesh et haketana ubagra tachtav mahu. To understand this question, we actually will need the very next Mishnah that we'll see in just a few minutes. This Mishnah records a machloket between Tanakama, who we'll see as Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Tanakama says that a Kohen Gadol, yes, we know that he cannot marry a divorcee. He cannot even marry an almanah. He has to marry betula. Rabbi Meir says that from the word bibtuleha, he derives that not only is it not sufficient that she was never married before and never with any man before, she actually has to be less than 12 and a half years old. He has to marry her. A Kohen Gadol has to marry a na'ara when she has the fullness of her bitulim. That's how he understands it. And so that's the law. We'll derive it in a minute. But based on that, we are asking a question. Kohen Gadol, okay, I know the law according to Rabbi Meir is that he would have to marry her but before she's 12 and a half. Okay, here's the question. What if he did Kiddushin with her while she was a Ketana, before 12 and a half years old, while she was Na'ara, and then they didn't do Nisuin right away. They waited, and Nisuin was done after she became a Bogeret, Bagra Tachtav. So is that okay? Batad Nisuin Azlinan or Batad Erusin Azlinan? Do we go by the time of the marriage, and at that point, she was too old, and he was not allowed to marry her, and it's no good? Or do we say, no, as long we go by the time of Kiddushin, and since the Kiddushin was at the right time, so then then it's fine if the Nisuin happens later. All right, that's his question. Okay, so he asked this question of Shemuel, and Shemuel gives a first answer. Maleh tinituha. Why are you asking that question? We can answer it from our very Mishnah, which said, Nit armelu or nit gareshu mina nisuin pesulot mina erusin kesherot. If someone is a Kohen is in a forbidden relationship with a divorcee, Kohen Gadol to almanah, and then either he died or they got divorced. So if they were fully married, pesulot, she, that wife, becomes halala, can no longer eat terumah ever, even if she later marries another Kohen or goes back to her father's house if she's bat Kohen. But if they were only engaged, kesherot, then it's okay, because engagement is not considered something significant in this regard. That prohibited relationship of engagement is temporary. She can, if they divorce or go back, she can go back to eating terumah. So what do you see here? That erusin is not a significant step regarding marriage to a Kohen. It's only nisuin that is significant. So we could use that to answer this question, that in fact this would be a problem for this Kohen Gadol, because he only did Erusin while she was under 12 and a half. And Erusin is not significant, not good enough. He has to do both Erusin and Nisuin before she's 12 and a half. Okay, so that seems like a fine answer. But and Rabbi Chia says, no, that you did not answer my question. I was not asking you. I know that to make her a halala, I was not asking about that, because in that case, one requires actually bi'ah to make her a halala, right? We talked about before, if you do kiddushin and chuppah, but without bi'ah, right? So even that is not sufficient. Really, that's bi'ah to make her halala. So that requires something a lot more, and my case is not equivalent to that. Vehu isha bibtuleha yikach mai kichad kiddushin ba'inan or kichad nisuin ba'inan. I'm asking an exegetical question. This pasuk from which we learned, this is the pasuk all about Kohen Gadol. It says, Vehu isha bibtuleha yikach. A Kohen Gadol has to take a wife, bibtuleha, with, you could translate with, while who is a virgin here, or with her hymen intact, which is, we're going to talk about in the next Mishnah. And then it continues and says, Almana ugrush v'chalala zona et ele lo yikach ki im betula mamav yikach isha. He cannot take a widow, divorced woman, or someone who's zona. Only betula me'amav he can take as a wife. So when it says this word here, yikach, to take, what does that word mean? That's what I'm asking you. Is it kicha of kiddushin, the first level of marriage? That's sufficient as long as she's 12 and a half before that? Or does the word kicha here mean, no, fully kiddushin and nisuin? That's my question. Oh, Shmuel says, okay, now I understand your question better. I also have another Mishnah that will answer your question. Mishnah coming up soon in this Masechet. Amar le hanameti nituha eres et almana v'nitmana liot Kohen Gadol yichnos. Here's an interesting case. A regular Kohen, not Kohen Gadol, he goes and does kiddushin with a widow. He's permitted. She's not divorcee. Okay, that's totally fine. Then all of a sudden, he is appointed to become Kohen Gadol, right? All of a sudden, the previous Kohen Gadol, he became Pasul, or he died, whatever. This guy's next in line, and now you're Kohen Gadol. Thing is, a Kohen Gadol cannot marry an Almanah, but can he be grandfathered in? Because he already did Kiddushin with an Almanah. And we say, Kan Yichnos, that's okay, he can continue, since he already had Kiddushin with this almanah, he can do nisuin with her, even though at that point he's already Kohen Gadol. So what do we see from here? This is a good equivalent case, right? We see that the kiddushin is significant. The kiddushin is what we're looking for, and just like in this case, since at the time of kiddushin it was permitted, and because he was a regular kohen, then he can go ahead and continue. So the kiddushin is the defining factor. So too, in your opening question, we'll look at the kiddushin. As long as she was under 12 and a half, this is when he's a Kohen Gadol from the beginning. And the Kohen Gadol took her as kiddushin before she was 12 and a half. Good, that's the clincher, that's what's important, and it doesn't matter if she became older afterwards and he does nisuin when she's more than 12 and a half. All right, this seems like a pretty good proof. But the Gemara says, no, maybe not. Shanehatam dichtiv yikach isha. Okay, in that case of the Kohen who becomes Kohen Gadol, there it says yikach isha. So it's right here in the second pasuk, mamav yikach isha. This isha is an extra word. Why do you say just im betula mamav yikach? What does the word isha mean? So we say this extra word comes to teach us that it's permitted in this case when the regular Kohen becomes Kohen Gadol, as long as he was, at the time he was Kohen, he did Kiddushin, so we go ahead with it and we can continue. So now we object to that. Hold on. Hachaname ketiv isha. This is not a different pasuk. This is the very same pasuk regarding a Kohen Gadol. And it says, so this word isha, you just said that, you can't compare the cases because it says yikach isha is coming to include some case where he can marry an isha, someone even though she's an almanah. He can marry her, the case when he was already engaged before he became Kohen Gadol. Well, why'd you pick isha to include that case? Why don't you take that same word isha and include the case that we asked to begin with, when he did kiddushin with her when she was a na'ara and she became a bogedet later. So you could say here yikach isha. Here's a case when he's allowed to marry her even though she is a bogedet, because he did kiddushin beforehand, and the word isha will include that. So we say no. Ahat velo shetayim. There's only one word isha here, so we can only learn one derivation. There's only one woman that we, in a regular case, normally he wouldn't be able to marry, but we can find a case where the kiddushin was done already, and then he can marry her. There's only one such case. All right, and that would be the one where he became a newly appointed Kohen Gadol. But now we ask, Umara'ita, and why? What? How come you prefer this over that? They seem to be equivalent cases. We say, no, they're not equivalent. Ha ishtane gufa, v'ha lo ishtane gufa. In the case where the case that you asked about, which was at the time of Kiddushin, she was a Na'ara, and then she became a Bogeret. Her body changed. She went from one stage to a different stage, and therefore you can't compare them. He did Kiddushin with one, but the Nisuin perhaps also has to be with a Na'ara, and so because she changed, that's a bigger Chidush to say that he's allowed to go ahead and do Nisuin after she became 12 and a half. Whereas it's simpler to say the other case where she didn't change at all. She's an almanah, she wasn't almanah, she remains an almanah. He's the one that changed. He beforehand was a regular Kohen, and now he became Kohen Gadol. So since she didn't undergo any change, so you could say he yikach isha, he can take a certain woman, even though she's an almanah. Normally Kohen Gadol can't, but because when he did Kiddushin, when he was a regular Kohen, that's what Isha is coming to include, and we can only include one case and not the other. And therefore, Shemuel, thank you for trying 2 different times with 2 Mishnayot to try to answer the question, but neither of them are a conclusive proof. Okay, so now we're already introduced to the topic of the next Mishnah, which is Kohen Gadol lo yisa almana, ben almana mina erusin, ben almana mina nisuin. So we know the Torah says explicitly, Kohen cannot marry a widow, and it doesn't matter how she became a widow, whether she only had Kiddushin with her first husband, or was fully married to her first husband, if she became a widow from after Kiddushin or after Nisuin, nevertheless, that's still called a widow. You don't say, oh, it's only Kiddushin with the first husband, so she's not such a widow. No, it doesn't matter. Kohen Gadol cannot marry either. Ve'lo yisata bogeret. And according to Tanakama here, who is Rabbi Meir, Kohen Gadol cannot even marry someone who is single, never touched a guy. If she's bogeret, if she's more than 12 and a half, that's it. Too late for him. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon machshirin bebogeret. However, the other 2 Tanaim say that's fine as long as she was long as she was never with anyone. It's fine. It doesn't matter if she's more than 12 and a half. Ve'lo yisa et mukat ayetz. And then we add that also Kohen Gadol cannot marry someone who's lost her bitulim not because of bi'ah, but rather by an accident. She fell on something, and that tore her bitulim. So although it was not through any bi'ah, it doesn't matter. Torah says bibtuleha. So it's just the bitulim have to be there. All right, that's Mishnah. Now Tenu Rabbanan. Almana lo yikach ben almana min erusin ben almana min hanisuin. We have a braita that says the same thing as the Mishnah, except that it's quoting the pasuk as well. So almana, he cannot marry, Kohen Gadol cannot marry. It doesn't matter whether she was only had kiddushin with the first husband or even nisuin with the first husband. Peshita, so isn't this obvious? Right? Why would you think otherwise? This is, kiddushin is almost marriage. They are bonded, and you need to get otherwise. And so she is called an almana if they had kiddushin and he dies. Okay, so maudatem, I would have thought lelef almana mitamar malala mina nisuin afkan mina nisuin ka mashma lan. Oh, I might have thought to make a gezerah from Tamar, who was married to Yehuda's son Ed, and he died, and then he's waiting for Onan, and the pasuk there says Vayomer Yehuda leTamar kalato shebi almana bet avich. And Onan dies also, and then Yehuda comes to her and says, be an almana, wait as an almana in the house of your father until Shelah, my third son, will grow up. Ki amar pen yamut gamhu ke'ahav. Yehuda, in his own mind, really didn't want to give a third child over in marriage because he was afraid that this child would die also. Okay, anyway, the point here is that it has the word almana, and almana here is defined as tamad here is an almana from nisuin, because he was fully married to Aed, and nevertheless she's called an almana. So there you go. Almana, we might have thought based on that almana is only an almana from nisuin, and so that's why this baraita has to come and add almana also, even if they only had kiddushin, she's still called an almana. Okay. Now we say, wait, you just brought was such a good proof, right? There's a nice gezerah shavaf to Tamar. She was married to both of those Ayed and Onan, and so why not actually learn that gezerah shavah? And we answer, Dumya di gerusha. Ma gerusha ben mina nisu ben mina erusin, af amana ben mina erusin ben mina nisuin. Because it should be comparable to divorcee. A Kohen cannot marry, a regular Kohen cannot marry a divorcee, just as a Kohen Gadol cannot marry an almana, and so the laws should be similar. And when we say gerusha, doesn't matter if she was fully married to her first husband or only had kiddushin to her first husband. Both equally require a get, and so both are gerushot. And so too, almana is defined the same way. It doesn't matter if she was only had kiddushin with her first husband or even nisuin. Both of them are an almana, and a Kohen Gadol cannot marry any almana at all. All right, and now we continue. Velo isa et habogeret. Okay, the Mishnah said that according to Tanakama, Kohen Gadol cannot marry the woman already in the status of bogeret, which means after she already has signs of development, which is after 12 and a half years on average. Tenor Rabbanan, vehu isha bibtuleha yikach. So now we have a braita that's going to explain the derivation from a pasuk. So since the pasuk says a Kohen Gadol has to take a woman bibtuleha, with her bitulim, he can marry. So what is that excluding? Perat lebogeret shekalu la betuleha divrei Rabbi Meir. This comes to exclude a bogeret because her betulim are gone. They're not really gone. They're just not as complete, not as full as they are at the point when she is a na'ara. When she's na'ara, they're in their original form. That's what he has to marry only her, and not later on when it may get more weakened or thinned out. Rabbi Meir says. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, machshirin bebogeret. Rabbi Shimon says, no, that's fine. But bibtulah just means that she has bitulim, and it doesn't matter even if she's older. Okay, b'mai kami palge. So, how exactly are they arguing about this? Rabbi Meir savar bitulah. Afilu miksat betulim mashma. Betuleha adiika kola betulim. So Rabbi Meir is learning from the fact that it doesn't just say betula. It could have said isha betula. And then that would have meant any type of betula, even if it's only a small amount of her betulim is there. But betuleha, her betulim, means the maximum amount. That membrane has to be in its fullest stage. And according to him, the fullest stage is at the time she is a na'ara. Bibtuleha. Okay, now while he's at it and deriving things from this word, it doesn't just say bituleha, but bibtuleha. So what is that extra bet coming to teach? Bichdarka in shelo kedarka lo. So Rabbi Meir is stringent regarding the age. It has to be under 12 and a half, but bibtuleha says that it's only a problem. A woman is only disqualified if she had bi'ah in a regular way, but in the irregular way from the back, no, that's okay. That does not affect her bitulim. So bibtulah means in the place where her bitulim is, that's where she will be affected and become disqualified for gadol. But lo kedarka does not affect bitulim, and so he's lenient in that regard. Okay, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Sabre Betula, Betula Shelema Mashma. And so the other opinions who are lenient regarding the age, they say Betula means full Betulim. Betuleha, afilu miksat Betulim. They're learning the opposite way. Betula would be full, but Betuleha means her Betulim, whatever they are, even if it's not in its fullness, even if she's older. That's okay, as long as there's any betulim there. That's permitted, so they're lenient in that regard. But then they have a stringency. Bibtuleha ad you call betuleha kayamin ben bichdarka ben shelo kedarka. According to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, the word betuleha means that she never had intercourse before, regardless of the membrane being intercourse, where the membrane is or not. That's not what it means, but rather any intercourse whatsoever, whether kedarka or lo kedarka. And so therefore Rabbi Elazar and Shimon are machmir and say that a woman who had any type of intercourse, even shelo kedarka, may not be with a Kohen Gadol. But they are lenient in saying that it doesn't matter what age she is, as long as she never had any kind of intercourse, that is fine, even if she is a bogeret. All right, now that we know this machloket, we're going to see a statement of Rav that relates to it. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Niv'ala shelo kedarka pesula lichehuna. Rav states that if a woman has intercourse, lo kedarka, she cannot be with a Kohen. And it seems he means specifically to the Kohen Gadol. Okay, so you see that he seems to follow Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Okay, however, Mativ Rava has a question, a challenge to Rav from a Baraita. The Baraita says, Velo tiyeh leisha. Pasuk in Devarim 22:29, that is talking about a man who rapes a na'ara, and if he has to pay the father for this damage that he's done, she will, when it's time for her to get married, she will not be able to acquire as much in the dowry. And furthermore, velotiyeh leisha, and the rapist he has obligated to marry her. She doesn't have to, but if she doesn't want to. But the point is, kind of the concept of you broke it, you bought it, that he is now going to have to feed, clothe, and provide shelter for her for the rest of her life, because it's now going to be more difficult for her to find a suitable marriage partner. And so therefore he is now responsible to take care of her for the rest of her life. Velotiyeh leisha. Okay, now that's what the pasuk says. Be'isha hadeuya lo. But the Midrash adds, only if it's someone who is allowed to marry. So if someone rapes a woman who he's not allowed to marry, then you can't require him to marry her. So pedat almana lekohen gadol gedusha v'chalusa lekohen hediot, and this will exclude a kohen gadol who rapes a na'ara. What kind of character is this kohen gadol? A separate question. But if he does, and that girl is an almana, then he does not have to take her, he cannot take her as a wife. Or if a regular Kohen should rape a Gerusha or Chalutza, then since he, even though for the usual consequence would be have to marry her, he doesn't have to marry because they're not allowed to be married. Okay, that's the end of the Braita. Now Rava derives his question. Hechidame, what kind of case would this be talking about with Kohen Gadol Almana? Ilema b'kederka, did he rape her in the normal way? Regular intercourse. My iria mishum almana. Then why are you saying only almana? Tipukle mishum davia be'ola. Even if this girl was not an almana, after the rape she would be be'ola, no longer a betula. Now, even though the Kohen Gadol is himself the one who took away her betulim and made her a be'ola, nevertheless he's not allowed to marry a be'ola, even if he's the one that caused her to be a be'ola. If it was not done within the bi'ah was not in marriage, but rather in through rape. So he would not Kohen Gadol. According to this, if he raped anyone, he would not have the consequence of having to marry them, because he's not allowed to marry someone who's not a betula. So why don't you say that? Ela lav shelo kedarka. So rather, the only case that this baraita would make sense in is if he raped her shelo kedarka, and umishum amanai mishum be'ola lo, and that's why the reason why he can't marry her must be because she previously was an almana, but because of be'ola, no, which means that bi'ah shelo kedarka does not make a woman a be'ola, and she can nevertheless marry Kohen Gadol. If it was only that was be'ula, she could marry the Kohen Gadol because it's shelo kedarka. And so this challenges Rav, who says that a woman who is nibala shelo kedarka cannot marry a Kohen Gadol. According to this would be the only case that would be the only case that's a problem is almana, because if it was just be'ula, even for lo kedarka, it would not be a problem. All right, so that's the question, and we answer kind of expectedly. Hamaneh Rabbi Meir. This baraita is following Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was the one who was lenient beforehand in the baraita we just saw, and he said this that bi'ah shelo kedarka does not render her a be'ola because it's not in the place of betulim. So and Rav damar Rabbi Elazar. Rav, who said his law that says not the stringent opinion, that would be Rabbi Elazar. Okay, so they each have their precedents, and that's Rav has a Tana who he follows. Okay, now we ask, Rabbi Elazar, my iriya mishum be'ola. During this discussion, we were assuming that if the problem was not almana, then it must be be'ola. But there's another possibility. Tepukle davya la zona. She also could be considered a zona. Taha amar Rabbi Elazar panui haba ala pinuya shelo l'shem ishut asa zona. Now, definition of zona, there are different definitions of it, but we're following Rabbi Elazar here. Rabbi Elazar has the most expansive definition of zona. He says even if you have a single man and a single woman who are permitted to each other, but they have bi'ah for the sake of zinut, not for the sake of marriage, that also makes her a zona. And therefore, in this case, a Kohen Gadol who rapes a woman would render her not only be'ola, but also a zona. And then he cannot marry her. She did nothing wrong, but nevertheless, she's a rape victim. Nevertheless, she is a zona. In this case, a zona would not be able to marry not only Kohen Gadol, but even a regular Kohen. But this whole thing, we're talking about the clause of Kohen Gadol. And so it seems that it's only a problem, if it was not a problem of Amana, it would be only a problem of Be'ula and not of Zona. That was what was assumed in this discussion in the interpretation of Rav. So now it's our question. How come we assumed it's only Be'ula? Maybe it's a problem of Zona also. And therefore, any case, even a regular Kohen, if a Kohen raped someone, he would be exempt from the obligation of marrying her because she is now made into a zona. Okay. Amar Rav Yosef, Kegon shenib'ala libhema tata mishum be'olaika mishum zona leka. So what we're looking for is a case of intercourse where the woman would be rendered a be'ola, but not a zona. So how could that be? Rav Yosef says, through bestiality, in that case, be'ola, it is considered intercourse, and so she's not a betula anymore, she's a be'ula, but we don't apply zinut. We'll see this opinion derived later on in this daf. So leka. That could be a case. However, Abaye rejects. Amar le'Abaye, mima nafshachi be'ola havya zona nami havya. Iri zona lahavya be'ola nami lahavya. So that doesn't make sense. The two definitions should go together. If she was be'ola, that would be the same as zona. Especially assuming the definition of Rabbi Elazar, and so even if it's not prohibited, all the more so if it is prohibited, and if it's not zona, then it will not be be'ola. So you cannot have a case like that. Bestiality would not be an example where we can find be'ola and not zona. And if you'll tell me, well, maybe we'll treat bestiality like the last case in the Mishnah, which is where a woman had a branch that broke her betulim, and in that case she is a be'ula, she's not a betula anymore because she doesn't have betulim, but she's not called a zonah. It was only a branch. So maybe you'll say that this case of the Kohen would be, maybe you'll say that bestiality rather is like muket shelo kedarka. Let's say someone has a branch. Sorry for being graphic here, and it is placed in her back side, and so that in that case there would not be the bitulim would remain. And yet she would still be prohibited to Kohen Gadol, as the last clause in the Mishnah said, that Mukat Etz cannot be with the Kohen. So look, here we have found a case, you'll say, you'll ask me, that you have a woman who is not a zonah, but she is erva. So then to say exception to Abaye's principle, and then we can have another exception too. We say no, that's not exception. Imken en lecha isha shekeshera lekehuna shelo na'ased mukat etz al yedei seror. A woman who has something in her backside is not considered a be'olah, because if so, then there would not be anyone who would be possibly marry a kehuna, because everyone would be in this category mukat es if you included something in the backside as being be'olah, then everyone would be a be'olah, because people in those days used to clean themselves after going to the bathroom with pebbles or pot shards and things like that, and so these things are inserted as a regular course all the time. And so then therefore we're obvious we're not considering inserting something in the backside to be anything like penetration, and we don't worry about it. It's not called be'ulah, so this is not a good example. Finally, we do have an example of such a case that can be be'olah banat zona ela marabi zera bim'ma'enet. If you have a minor girl whose mother or brother marries her off, and she's married and she has to be out with this husband, and then as she gets older, before she becomes an adult, she rejects the marriage. She has a right to refuse the marriage, in which case retroactively she was never married. So in this case, those bi'ot that she had with her husband are not zinut, because they were perfectly legal, because she was married at the time. And so now we're undoing it. Okay, so she is be'olah. She's for sure be'olah. She had regular intercourse with a man, and so she is be'olah, but not a zonah, and therefore we do in fact have such a case. And therefore Rav could have been talking about this very case, and that's why we assume that if it's not a problem of almana, then it would be a problem of be'olah, and not a problem of zonah, because in this case she is not a zonah. All right, now regarding being with an animal, let's discuss that further. Amar Shimi bar Chiya nib'ala libhema keshera lechuna. So Rav Shimi says, if a woman was with an animal, nevertheless she can marry a Kohen. She has other problems, but this is not one of them. She can marry. Okay. Even a Kohen Gadol. Tanyana mehachin nib'ala lemi sheno ish afal pi shebiskila keshera lechuna. If someone has bi'ah with someone who is not that is not human, meaning an animal, even though she gets sikila. So you see, this is not a good thing. She would get the death penalty by stoning. Nevertheless, in the meantime, if she was somehow able to avoid stoning, if there weren't witnesses or so on, then she could in fact marry a Kohen. And we have a story, in fact, that follows this ruling. Ki atarav dimi amar maaseh b'riba achat behitelu she'ayta mechabedet et habayit. The story about a young girl in this village here of Itlu, and she was sweeping the house. And all of a sudden a village dog came from behind her and had bi'ah with her from the back. The case came to the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he said she can marry a Kohen, not a problem. Amar Shmuel Kohen Gadol, and Shmuel clarifies it can even be to a Kohen Gadol because it was from the back. She still has her bitulim, and so that's not a problem. She's not a be'ula. She's also not a zonah because this is zinut would only be with from a human, and not this case. It is. I mean, in some ways it's worse, and there would be sikila, but it doesn't get the label of zinut. Now we ask, Kohen Gadol hava? Kohen Gadol. In time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, there was no Kohen Gadol. So what do you mean? He said, okay, go marry this Kohen Gadol. No, what he meant is that she would be fit to marry a Kohen Gadol if there were a Kohen Gadol. And so that's a story of putting that Pesach in practice. Amar Rava mipirkin le Rav Asher. So this Rava from Pirkin asked Rav Asher. This is a later Rava, Rav Asher in 6th generation, so it's not the usual Rava of the 4th generation. Menaha midleta damud banan en zinut libhema. Here's what's the source that the rabbis say that regarding an animal is not a concept of zinut. Now, the Peshat of this pasuk is different, rather different than the way it's the Gemara is going to explain it. So let's explain it first. Lo taviat nan zonah, you shall not bring the fee of a zonah or the pay of a dog. So this is referring to female prostitutes and male prostitutes. These were common in ancient Near Eastern temples. And so the Torah says one cannot use that money that was paid for any of these services that sometimes were involved in pagan fertility rites. We don't want that in the Mishkan at all. And therefore, you cannot use it in payment, that money in payment for a neder. If you vowed an animal, you cannot pay for it with such money, because to'avat Adonai Elohecha gam shenehem, both of these, this type of zonah and the male, is our abomination. So you cannot use these two. All right, that seems to be the peshat of the pasuk. However, the Midrash is going to take it not as not talking about the money, but rather the animal itself, since it says you cannot bring this item as a sacrifice. So we're talking about the sheep itself. So what kind of cases here can we would it be relevant to? I'm going to read the Rambam, who I think makes it very clear. And then we'll know what the 4 cases is talking about. Two are allowed and 2 are not allowed. Kosher animals, like a lamb, given that you could use as a sacrifice, given as payment for the services of a prostitute. So one pays the prostitute with an animal or with a sheep. That you cannot use as a sacrifice or as payment for the purchase of a dog, right? Or like trading a sheep with a dog, using the sheep to buy a dog, also not fit. That's what they take as mechir kelev. Okay, that you cannot use that sheep as an offering. However, if one takes a sheep and gives it as payment to buy the zonah as a maidservant, right? He wants to actually acquire her and make her his maidservant, and he uses the sheep to pay for it. That sheep can be sacrificed, or he is giving it as payment to the dog's owner for permission to have intercourse with that dog. That payment of the sheep, that sheep also is permitted to use as an offering. Okay, so these are the 4 cases, and so now let's see what the proof is. Utanan, we have a Mishnah in Timura. Etnan kelev umchir zona mutarin mishum shenemar gam shenehem shenayim velo arba. And so we learned in that Mishnah that since the rest of the pasuk says 2 of these things are an abomination, so 2 but not 4, so that means only 2 are prohibited, but the other 2 are permitted. So which case is permitted? As we just saw, either buying the zonah or for permission for bi'ah with the kelev, which means that this is not called zinut. And therefore, since Right, etnan zona. So this case is excluded from the word, from the definition of zona, and therefore a person who is with an animal is not thereby considered a zona. And so that's the proof that we were assuming before from this very pasuk. Okay, we will end here. A lot of strange and interesting cases today. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.